The orc warrior's blood soaked through the torn leather of her armor, as she pressed one trembling hand against the wound in her side, her vision blurring at the edges while she stared up at the human man who had found her collapsed in his wheat field. "Finish it," Zasha whispered, her voice rough with pain and resignation, because every human she had ever encountered had tried to kill her on sight, and this one held a pitchfork in his calloused hands, and she was too weak to fight anymore. But instead of driving the tool through her chest, the man set it aside, crouched down beside her with concern etched across his weathered face, and said in a voice that was surprisingly gentle, "Let me get you inside first. I was just about to start dinner." Zasha's mind struggled to process his words through the fog of pain and blood loss. Finish it. She had said finish it. Every orc knew that humans showed no mercy, that they would sooner spit on a dying greenskin than offer aid. Yet this human was sliding his arms beneath her body, lifting her with a grunt of effort that spoke to her considerable weight, all muscle and bone bred for battle. She tried to protest, to push him away, but her limbs felt like they were filled with sand, heavy and unresponsive. "Easy now," the man said, his breath coming harder as he carried her across the field toward a modest farmhouse that sat surrounded by golden wheat swaying in the evening breeze. "I have seen plenty of wounds in my time. That needs cleaning and stitching, or you will be dead by morning. Why?" The words scraped past Zasha's tusks, barely audible. Why would he help her? Why would he touch her without disgust twisting his features? Why would he risk whatever consequences came from harboring an orc? The man did not answer immediately, too focused on navigating the narrow path between the wheat rows without jostling her too severely. Zasha caught glimpses of his face as her head lolled against his shoulder. He was perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. A scar ran along his jawline, old and pale, the mark of someone who had seen violence before. The farmhouse interior was simple but clean, with rough-hewn furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The man carried her to a long table near the hearth and laid her down with surprising care, his hands steady despite the blood now staining his shirt. "My name is Edmund Larson," he said, moving to the fireplace where a pot of water already hung over banked coals. "I am going to need you to stay conscious if you can. This will hurt." Zasha's fingers curled against the wooden table as she watched him work, stoking the fire until flames licked at the pot, gathering clean cloths from a chest against the wall, retrieving a needle and thread from a small box. Her warrior's instinct screamed that this was a trap, that he would wait until she was vulnerable and then strike, but the wound in her side was deep enough that she could feel her own heartbeat pulsing blood through the torn flesh. She had no choice but to trust him or die here on this table. "Why?" she asked again, forcing the word out with more strength this time. Edmund glanced at her as he cleaned his hands in a basin of water, his expression unreadable. "Because leaving someone to bleed out in my field seemed like poor hospitality," he said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only a matter-of-fact practicality that confused her more than hostility would have. He approached with the steaming water and clean cloths, and Zasha braced herself as he began to cut away the ruined leather of her armor. The fabric of her undershirt came next, exposing the wound a sword strike that had carved through the meat of her side, missing vital organs by a mercy she had not earned. Edmund's hands were careful as he cleaned the blood away, his touch clinical rather than cruel, and Zasha found herself studying his face for signs of the disgust she expected to see. "How did this happen?" Edmund asked, his voice quiet as he worked. "Humans," Zasha said, the word bitter on her tongue. A patrol found me hunting near the border. They decided an orc in their territory needed to be eliminated. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only continued cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. When he reached for the needle and thread, Zasha forced herself to breathe steadily, to show no weakness even as he pushed the needle through her skin and began to stitch the ragged edges together. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she had endured worse. She had been trained since childhood to withstand agony, to push through injuries that would fell lesser warriors. "You were a soldier," she said, watching his hands work. It was not a question. No farmer learned to stitch wounds with such confidence without battlefield experience. "Once," Edmund admitted, tying off the first stitch and beginning another. "Long enough to know what war looks like, long enough to be tired of it." Zasha wanted to ask more, but the world was starting to tilt and spin in ways that had nothing to do with the pain. Blood loss was dragging her down into darkness, and she fought against it, fought to stay conscious because sleeping in the presence of a human felt like the worst kind of vulnerability. But Edmund must have seen her struggle because his voice became firmer, almost commanding. "Sleep if you need to," he said, focused on his stitching. "I am not going anywhere, and neither are you until that wound begins to heal." The darkness pulled at her, insistent and heavy, and Zasha's last conscious thought was that if she woke to a blade in her heart, at least it would be a quick death. Then the world went black, and she knew nothing at all. When awareness returned, it came in fragments. The crackle of fire in the hearth, the scent of something cooking, rich and savory, the soft texture of a blanket covering her body. Zasha's eyes opened slowly, her vision clearer now, and she realized she was no longer on the table but had been moved to a pallet near the fire, her wound dressed with clean bandages. Evening had turned to full night, darkness pressing against the windows, and Edmund sat at the table with a wooden bowl in his hands, eating what looked like stew. He noticed her stirring and set the bowl aside, rising to approach with another bowl in hand. "You have been out for a few hours," he said, kneeling beside the pallet. "I made rabbit stew. You should try to eat something if you can manage it." Zasha stared at the offered bowl as though it might contain poison, her mind still struggling to reconcile this human's actions with everything she had been taught about his kind. Edmund seemed to recognize her suspicion because he took the bowl back, lifted a spoonful to his own mouth, and swallowed before offering it to her again. "Not poisoned," he said simply. "Just food." She took the bowl with shaking hands, her body too weak to lift it properly, and Edmund helped her sit up enough to eat without choking. The stew was simple but well made, vegetables and meat in a savory broth that warmed her from the inside. Zasha ate slowly, each swallow an effort, but the food helped push back the lingering fog in her mind. "Why did you not kill me?" she asked when she had eaten half the bowl, the question that had haunted her since she first woke. Edmund returned to his seat at the table, picking up his own bowl again. "Why would I? Because I am an orc. Because your people and mine have been enemies for generations. Because every human I have ever encountered tried to put a blade in me." "Then you have encountered the wrong humans," Edmund said, his tone mild. "I have killed enough people in my life. I have no interest in adding to that count unless someone gives me no choice." "You were a soldier," Zasha said, remembering his earlier admission. "What war?" "The border conflicts 5 years back," Edmund said, and something painful flickered across his face. "I was conscripted into the king's army, sent north to fight over land that neither side really needed. I saw friends die in the mud. I killed men who were probably as tired of fighting as I was. When my service ended, I took my pay and bought this land as far from any border as I could manage. I wanted to grow wheat and live quietly, and never hold a weapon again." Zasha absorbed this information slowly, her warrior's mind trying to fit this gentle farmer into the category of enemy and failing. "You do not hate orcs." "I do not know enough orcs to hate them," Edmund said, meeting her eyes steadily. "I know you. You are wounded and needed help." That was enough. The simple humanity of his answer made something twist uncomfortably in Zasha's chest, an emotion she had no name for because mercy was not something her clan had taught her to expect from humans. She finished the stew in silence, and when Edmund took the empty bowl, she let herself sink back against the pallet, exhaustion pulling at her again. "Sleep," Edmund said, moving to bank the fire for the night. "We can talk more in the morning." Zasha wanted to argue that she should leave, that staying here put both of them at risk, but her body betrayed her with its weakness, and sleep claimed her again before she could form the words. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Edmund tended his farm during the daylight hours while Zasha slept or rested by the fire, her body slowly knitting itself back together with the stubborn resilience of orc physiology. He changed her bandages each morning and evening, his hands impersonal and efficient, and he cooked meals that he shared without complaint, stew and bread, and roasted vegetables from his garden. Simple fare that tasted better than anything Zasha had eaten in the war camps of her clan. On the third day, she was strong enough to stand without swaying, to walk a few steps before her side pulled with warning pain. Edmund watched from the doorway as she tested her limits, his expression unreadable, and when she finally sat back down with a frustrated growl, he brought her a cup of water and a slice of bread with honey. "Healing takes time," he said, and there was something knowing in his voice, the understanding of someone who had recovered from his own wounds. "Pushing too hard will only set you back." "My clan will think I am dead," Zasha said, accepting the bread because hunger gnawed at her despite her frustration. "They will not come looking for me." "Is that good or bad?" Zasha considered the question while she ate, the sweetness of the honey strange on her tongue. Her clan had cast her out the moment she failed to kill a human child during a raid, when she had looked into the terrified eyes of a girl no older than 10, and found she could not drive her blade through that small chest. Weakness, her chieftain had called it. Betrayal. They had stripped her of her rank and sent her from their territory with nothing but her armor and weapons, and she had been wandering the borderlands ever since, hunting to survive and avoiding both human and orc settlements. "Good, I think," she finally said. "They would kill me themselves if they knew I was accepting help from a human." Edmund absorbed this with a slow nod, then rose to return to his work, leaving her to rest. But that evening, as they sat together by the fire eating dinner, he asked questions about her life, about orc culture and traditions, and Zasha found herself answering despite her better judgment. She told him about the harsh beauty of the northern mountains where her clan made their home, about the training that began in childhood and never truly ended, about the honor codes and the warrior's path that had defined her entire existence, until she broke the most sacred rule and showed mercy to an enemy. "You were cast out for not killing a child," Edmund said, and anger edged his voice for the first time since she had met him. "What kind of honor is that? The only honor my people know," Zasha said, staring into the fire. "Strength is everything. Mercy is weakness. I knew the price when I lowered my blade, and yet you chose mercy anyway." Yes, the admission felt strange, like confessing to a crime she did not fully regret. "I looked at that child and saw my younger sister. I could not do it." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "Then your clan cast out the wrong person. You showed more honor in that moment than most warriors show in a lifetime." The words settled into Zasha's chest, warm and unexpected, and she found she had no response to offer except to change the subject, to ask Edmund about his farm and his wheat and the quiet life he had built here in the middle of nowhere. He answered easily, his voice taking on a contented tone as he spoke about the land and the work and the satisfaction of growing things instead of destroying them. That night, as Zasha lay on the pallet while Edmund slept in his own bed on the far side of the room, she found herself thinking about the human's kindness, about the way he moved through the world with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had been taught about his kind. It was dangerous to trust him, dangerous to let her guard down, but with each passing day it became harder to maintain the walls she had built around herself. By the end of the first week, Zasha could walk around the farmhouse without pain, though Edmund still insisted she avoid any strenuous activity. She began to help with small tasks despite his protests, mending tools, preparing vegetables for meals, feeding the chickens that scratched around the yard. Edmund watched her with something that might have been amusement as she glared at the birds, unused to such mundane creatures after a lifetime of hunting and fighting. "They are not going to attack you," he said, trying and failing to hide his smile. "They are unpredictable," Zasha muttered, eyeing a particularly aggressive hen. "I do not trust them." Edmund's laugh was warm and genuine, and Zasha found herself watching the way his face transformed with mirth, the hard lines softening into something younger and lighter. The sound did something strange to her heart, made it beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with injury or exertion. She looked away quickly, disturbed by her own reaction. The second week brought stronger tests of her recovery. Zasha ventured outside more, walking the perimeter of the farm, studying the wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon in golden waves. The land here was beautiful in a way that the harsh mountains of her homeland were not, gentle and abundant, and she understood why Edmund had chosen it. This was a place for building rather than destroying, for growing rather than taking. One afternoon, she found Edmund working in his garden, pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables, and without thinking she knelt beside him and began to help. He glanced at her in surprise but said nothing, and they worked together in companionable silence while the sun moved across the sky. Zasha's hands, so accustomed to gripping weapons, felt clumsy with the delicate work of gardening, but Edmund showed her which plants to remove and which to preserve, his patience inexhaustible. "You are good at this," Zasha said eventually, gesturing to the thriving garden. "I have had practice," Edmund replied, sitting back on his heels to wipe sweat from his brow. "The first year was a disaster. I killed more plants than I grew, but you learn through failure, I suppose. That is not how orc training works. Failure means death or exile. That sounds exhausting." Zasha blinked at the simple observation, then found herself laughing a rough, rusty sound that surprised them both. Edmund grinned at her, and the moment felt impossibly light, as though they were not an orc and a human but simply two people sharing a joke in a garden. That night, Edmund taught her to make bread, his hands guiding hers through the process of kneading dough, showing her the right consistency and texture. Zasha was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his body beside hers, the casual way he touched her hands to correct her technique. Her heart beat faster again, that same strange rhythm, and she wondered if he could hear it, if he knew what his kindness was doing to her carefully maintained composure. The bread they made together was imperfect but edible, and they ate it warm with butter while the fire crackled in the hearth, and Zasha thought that this moment, this simple, domestic peace was more foreign to her than any battlefield she had ever walked. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, emboldened by the easy atmosphere. "Were you never married?" Something shadowed Edmund's expression, a flash of old pain. I was engaged once before the war. She died of fever while I was away fighting. By the time I returned, she was already buried." "I am sorry," Zasha said, and meant it. "It was a long time ago," Edmund said quietly. "I mourned her. I still mourn her in some ways, but life moves forward whether we are ready or not. I built this farm because I needed a reason to keep moving." Zasha understood that kind of grief, the weight of loss that never quite left. She had lost friends in battle, had watched her sister die during a raid when they were both young, had carried those deaths with her through every year since. "Your woman would be proud of what you built here," she said, and Edmund's grateful smile made her chest ache. The third week brought visitors. Zasha was outside splitting firewood, a task Edmund had finally permitted after she proved her side, had healed enough for moderate exertion, when she heard the sound of horses approaching down the road. Her warrior instincts kicked in immediately, every muscle tensing, and she dropped the axe to reach for weapons she no longer carried. Edmund must have heard the horses too, because he emerged from the wheat field, concern creasing his brow. "Inside," he said quietly to Zasha. "Quickly." She wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but the look in Edmund's eyes was urgent enough that she obeyed, slipping into the farmhouse and pressing herself against the wall beside the window where she could watch without being easily seen. 3 riders approached, all human men wearing the rough clothing of farmers or merchants, and Edmund walked out to meet them with apparent calm. "Edmund Larson," one of the men called, dismounting. He was older than Edmund, with gray threading through his beard, and his eyes were hard. "We are here on behalf of the village council. There are reports of an orc in this area. Have you seen anything?" Zasha's heart hammered against her ribs. Someone had seen her, or seen signs of her presence. She watched Edmund's face, waiting to see if he would betray her if his kindness had reached its limit. "An orc," Edmund said, his voice carefully neutral. "No, I have not seen any orcs, just wheat and chickens, same as always." "Merchant passed through last week, swore he saw orc tracks near your property line," the older man pressed. "Said they looked fresh. Could have been deer tracks," Edmund said with a slight shrug. "The merchant might have been nervous, seeing threats where there were none. You know how travelers get in unfamiliar territory." The older man studied Edmund with narrowed eyes, clearly skeptical. "You will let us search your property then, just to be certain." Zasha saw Edmund's jaw tighten, a muscle jumping, but he nodded. "Of course, search all you like. I have nothing to hide." The 3 men spread out, checking the barn and the outbuildings while Edmund stood with forced patience, his hands loose at his sides but tension radiating from every line of his body. Zasha remained frozen by the window, barely breathing, her mind racing through options. If they found her, Edmund would be accused of harboring an orc. At best, he would be exiled from his land. At worst, they would hang him as a traitor. She could not let that happen. She would not repay his kindness with his death. Slowly, carefully, Zasha moved away from the window toward the back of the farmhouse. There was a rear door that opened onto the fields, and if she could slip out while the men were focused on the outbuildings, she could disappear into the wheat and be gone before they ever knew she was here. It would mean leaving Edmund behind, abandoning the first peace she had known in years, but better that than seeing him harmed because of her. Her hand was on the door latch when she heard heavy footsteps on the front porch. "House is clear," one of the men called, and Zasha pressed herself into the shadows beside the fireplace, every sense screaming danger. The door opened, and 2 of the men entered, their eyes scanning the interior with professional thoroughness. They moved through the main room, checking behind furniture, and Zasha's hand drifted to where her knife would have been if she still carried one. One of the men approached the fireplace, so close that Zasha could smell the horse sweat on him, and she prepared to fight, to do whatever necessary to escape. But then Edmund's voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked, an edge to his tone now. "Or are you satisfied that I am not harboring any monsters?" The two men exchanged glances, then moved back toward the door. "Clear," the younger one said. "Nothing here." Zasha exhaled slowly, realizing they had somehow failed to see her pressed against the stones in the shadows. Perhaps the afternoon light pouring through the windows had blinded them to the darker corners. Perhaps luck had finally turned in her favor. She remained utterly still as the men left, as their footsteps retreated across the porch, as the sound of horses faded down the road. Only when Edmund returned inside and closed the door did she step out from the shadows, her whole body trembling with aftermath adrenaline. "That was too close," Edmund said, his face pale. "They will be back if they find any evidence." I need to leave," Zasha finished, the words tasting like ash. "I should have left days ago. I am putting you at risk by staying here." "Where will you go?" Edmund demanded, and the emotion in his voice surprised her. "Back to wandering alone, bleeding out in someone else's field." "That is not your concern." "Like hell it is not." Edmund closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his storm-gray eyes blazing. "You think I saved your life just to watch you throw it away? You think I spent 3 weeks helping you heal so you could walk back into danger?" "I think you have already risked enough for me," Zasha shot back, her own anger rising to meet his. "I think if those men come back and find me here, they will kill you for the crime of showing mercy to an orc. I will not have your death on my conscience." "Then stay," Edmund said, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. "Stay and help me with the farm. Stay where you are safe. Stay because he stopped himself, jaw clenching, but the words hung between them anyway, half-formed and weighted with meaning. Zasha stared at him, her heart doing that too-fast thing again, her mind struggling against the impossible hope his words had kindled. "You what?" she whispered. Edmund looked away, conflict warring across his features. Then he seemed to come to some decision, his shoulders squaring as he met her eyes again. "Stay because I have gotten used to having you here, because I like talking to you. Because I look forward to seeing you every morning and teaching you to make bread and listening to your stories about the mountains. Stay because this farm is too quiet without you." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous, and Zasha felt something crack open in her chest. Some wall she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. She took a step toward Edmund, then another, until they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "I am an orc," she said softly, needing him to understand. "Your people will always see me as a monster. They will never accept this, whatever this is becoming." "I do not care what they accept," Edmund said, his hand rising to hover near her face, not quite touching. "I care what I see when I look at you, and I see someone brave enough to spare a child, someone strong enough to survive wounds that would kill most people. Someone who learned to make bread even though her hands are made for holding swords." His fingers brushed her cheek then, gentle and deliberate. "I see someone I do not want to lose." Zasha closed her eyes against the surge of emotion, her own hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. "This is madness," she breathed. "Probably," Edmund agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "But I have had enough of being sensible. Sensible got me 5 years alone on this farm. Maybe it is time to try something mad instead." When Zasha opened her eyes, Edmund was watching her with such open warmth that it stole her breath. She had faced down armed soldiers without fear, had walked into battle knowing she might not walk out again. but this moment terrified her more than any blade ever had. Because if she let herself want this, let herself believe in the impossible, the loss would destroy her. But Edmund was still touching her face, still looking at her like she was something precious rather than monstrous, and Zasha found she was not strong enough to walk away. "I will stay," she said, the words barely audible. "For now. But if more trouble comes, I am leaving whether you like it or not. I will not see you harmed because of me." "Deal," Edmund said. And then he was smiling that warm smile that made her heart race. And Zasha thought that maybe she had been wrong about everything she had ever believed regarding humans and mercy, and the possibility of finding peace in a world built on war. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most wonderful of Zasha's life. She fell into the rhythm of farm work with surprising ease, her warrior's strength an asset in hauling water and mending fences, and helping Edmund harvest the wheat when it finally ripened to gold. They worked side by side through the late summer days, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane, and Zasha discovered she liked this human more with every passing hour. Edmund was patient when she struggled with unfamiliar tasks, teaching her to milk the cow without spooking the animal, showing her how to preserve vegetables for the coming winter, explaining the careful balance required to maintain a working farm. In turn, Zasha taught him things from her own experience: how to track game through the forest, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to fight with nothing but your hands if weapons failed. One afternoon, she caught him staring at her while she worked, his expression soft with something she was afraid to name. "What?" she asked, self-conscious under his gaze. "Nothing," Edmund said, but he was smiling. "Just thinking how much I like having you here." The words settled warm in Zasha's chest, and she ducked her head to hide the pleased flush darkening her green skin. "I am only staying until trouble finds us," she reminded him, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Trouble might never find us," Edmund said lightly. "The world is large. We could just be two people living quietly, causing no harm. You know that is not how this works." "Maybe it should be." Zasha had no answer for that, so she returned to her work, but Edmund's words echoed in her mind for days afterward. Maybe it should be. What a revolutionary thought, that an orc and a human could simply exist together without violence, without judgment, without the weight of history crushing them. It seemed impossible, but then again, she was living on a human farm, sharing meals with a man who made her laugh, and that had seemed impossible too until it was not. Autumn arrived with cooler nights and changing leaves, painting the world in shades of amber and rust. Edmund began preparing for winter, insulating the farmhouse and stockpiling firewood, and Zasha helped with the endless tasks, her body strong and fully healed now. They developed an easy domesticity, moving around each other in the small space with unconscious familiarity, anticipating needs before they were spoken. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Edmund asked about her family. Zasha told him about her sister, about the raid that had taken her life when Zasha was barely old enough to hold a sword properly. She told him about her parents, both warriors who had died with honor in battle, and about the clan that had raised her after their deaths, the harsh lessons and harsher teachers who had forged her into the fighter she became. "You miss it?" Edmund asked gently. "The clan?" Zasha considered the question while firelight danced across the walls. "I miss the sense of belonging," she admitted. "Knowing my place, my purpose. But I do not miss the constant violence, the endless raids and battles that served no real purpose except to prove strength. I do not miss looking into the eyes of enemies and seeing only fear and hatred." She glanced at Edmund, finding him watching her with that steady, accepting gaze. I do not miss being unable to choose mercy. You have a place here, Edmund said softly, if you want it. The offer hung between them, loaded with implications neither had fully voiced. Zasha's heart hammered in her chest as she held his gaze, seeing the truth written plainly in his eyes. This had become more than shelter, more than friendship. Somewhere in the shared meals and quiet conversations and everyday intimacy of working side by side, something deeper had taken root. Edmund, she said carefully, you know what this would mean, what we would be choosing. I know. His hand found hers in the space between them, fingers intertwining. I know it would be dangerous. I know we would have to be careful, keep to ourselves, maybe lie when people ask questions. I know your people would see it as betrayal and mine would see it as perversion. I know all of that. He squeezed her hand gently. I also know that I am happier with you here than I have been in 5 years alone, and I hope you might feel the same. Zasha's throat tightened with emotion, her warrior's composure cracking under the weight of his honesty. I do, she whispered. I feel the same, but I am afraid, Edmund. I'm afraid of what wanting this costs. I'm afraid of losing it. I'm afraid of getting you killed. Then we will be afraid together, Edmund said, and he pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. Zasha leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that as the fire burned down to embers, holding each other in the quiet dark, and Zasha thought that this feeling, this sense of being held and valued and safe was worth any risk. Winter came hard and fast, bringing snow that blanketed the farm in white silence. Zasha and Edmund settled into the enforced closeness of cold weather, spending long evenings by the fire while wind howled outside. They talked and read and taught each other songs from their respective cultures, Edmund's human ballads mixing with Zasha's orcish war chants in strange harmony. One particularly cold night, Edmund looked up from the book he was reading and said, I think I am falling in love with you. The words were so simple, so plainly spoken, that Zasha almost missed their weight. Then understanding crashed over her, stealing her breath, and she set aside the wood carving she had been working on a small bird that Edmund had admired. What? I am falling in love with you, Edmund repeated, meeting her eyes steadily. Maybe I have been for a while. I just thought you should know. Zasha's hands shook as she processed this confession, her mind reeling. Love. The concept was so foreign to orc culture, where matings were matters of strength and political advantage rather than emotion. But she understood what Edmund meant, understood the feeling that had been growing in her own chest, the way her happiness had become tangled up in his. I do not know how to do this, she said, her voice breaking. I was not raised for gentleness. I do not know how to be what you need. Edmund crossed the space between them, kneeling beside her chair. You do not have to be anything except yourself, he said, taking her shaking hands in his steady ones. You do not have to change or perform or pretend. I fell in love with who you are, the orc warrior who learned to make bread and argued with my chickens and carved birds by the firelight. Just be that person. That is enough. Tears stung Zasha's eyes, a weakness she had never permitted herself, and when they fell, Edmund caught them on his thumbs, wiping them away with such tenderness that she nearly broke apart entirely. I love you too, she managed, the words clumsy and uncertain but true. I do not know when it happened, but I love you and it terrifies me. Edmund's smile was brilliant and beautiful, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm against hers, gentle but insistent. Zasha kissed him back with all the desperation and hope she had been holding inside, her tusks an awkward obstacle that they navigated together, learning the geography of this new intimacy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. "We will figure this out," he promised. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." Zasha believed him. The winter passed in a bubble of hard-won happiness. They grew more comfortable with affection, with stolen kisses and shared warmth, with speaking the words they had both been afraid to voice. Edmund taught Zasha to read using his collection of books, and she proved an eager student, devouring stories of far-off places and impossible adventures. In turn, she taught him the martial disciplines of her people, helping him regain some of the warrior's edge he had deliberately dulled, not for violence, but for the satisfaction of maintaining his skills. But winter could not last forever, and as spring approached, bringing the promise of travelers and merchants and curious neighbors, Zasha's anxiety returned. She knew they had been living in borrowed time, that eventually someone would notice her presence, and the tenuous peace they had built would shatter. The reckoning came on a warm day in early spring, when the snow had melted and green was beginning to return to the world. Zasha was in the garden planting seeds while Edmund worked in the barn, both of them comfortable in the routine of farm tasks. She did not hear the horses approach over the sound of her own work, did not realize they had visitors until a shadow fell across her, and a voice said, "Well, this is interesting." Zasha's head snapped up to find 4 men standing at the garden's edge, all armed with swords at their belts. The speaker was the same older man who had come months earlier, his hard eyes now gleaming with something like triumph. "I knew Larson was lying," he said. "No one defends their empty property that hard unless they have got something to hide." Zasha rose slowly to her feet, her mind calculating distances and odds. 4 armed men against 1 unarmed orc was poor mathematics, but she had survived worse. "Leave," she said, putting command into her voice. "This does not concern you. An orc living with a human farmer concerns everyone in the valley," the older man said. "You are coming with us, Greenskin, and Larson is going to answer for the crime of harboring you." "Over my dead body," Zasha said flatly, and she meant it. These men were not taking Edmund anywhere, not if she had to fight through all 4 of them with her bare hands. The men drew their swords, spreading out in a semicircle that cut off her escape routes. Zasha backed toward the barn, toward where she knew Edmund kept tools that could serve as weapons, but before she could reach the door, Edmund himself appeared, his pitchfork in hand and murder in his eyes. "Get off my property," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Now." "Edmund Larson, you are under arrest for harboring an enemy of humanity," the older man said. "Surrender peacefully and your punishment will be light. Resist and we will kill you both." "I would love to see you try," Edmund said, and there was the soldier in him now, the warrior he had tried to bury beneath wheat and peaceful living. He moved to stand beside Zasha, presenting a united front, and something in his stance must have communicated serious threat because the men hesitated. "There are 4 of us and 2 of you," one of the younger men said, trying for bravado. "You cannot win this." "Perhaps not," Edmund agreed. "But I guarantee at least 2 of you die before I go down. Maybe 3 if my orc is as good as I think she is. Are you willing to take those odds? Are you willing to be the ones who do not make it home?" The men exchanged uncertain glances. This was not going as they had planned. They had expected to intimidate a peaceful farmer and capture a weak orc, not face down 2 opponents who looked ready and willing to fight to the death. "This is madness," the older man said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "You would throw your life away for a monster." "She is not a monster," Edmund said, steel in every word. "She is someone who deserves to live in peace, same as anyone else, and I will defend her right to that peace with everything I have." Zasha's heart swelled at his words, at his unwavering defense of her, but she also knew this standoff could not end well. Either they would fight and people would die, or they would surrender and face whatever justice these humans deemed appropriate. Neither option was acceptable. "Edmund," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the armed men, "you do not have to do this. Let them take me. Save yourself." "No." The word was absolute, brooking no argument. "We stand together or not at all." The older man seemed to sense his control of the situation slipping. "You are both going to hang for this," he said, trying to regain authority. "The council will not tolerate this perversion." "Then I guess we have nothing to lose," Edmund said, and shifted his grip on the pitchfork, preparing to strike. Everything happened at once. The four men charged forward, swords raised, and Edmund met the first one with his pitchfork, turning the blade aside with surprising skill. Zasha grabbed a shovel from where it leaned against the barn and swung it like a weapon, the flat of the blade catching one attacker across the face and sending him sprawling. But there were too many, too coordinated, and within moments Zasha found herself surrounded, a sword point pressed to her throat while two men held Edmund pinned against the barn wall. "Enough," the older man barked, blood streaming from his broken nose where Zasha's shovel had connected. "You are both under arrest. Bind them." Rough hands grabbed Zasha's arms, wrenching them behind her back, and she snarled as rope bit into her wrists. Beside her, Edmund struggled against his captors until a fist to his stomach stole his breath and left him gasping. They were hauled together, forced to their knees in the dirt, and Zasha met Edmund's eyes across the small distance, seeing her own fear and rage reflected there. "I am sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every part of her soul. Sorry for bringing this down on him. Sorry for not leaving when she had the chance. Sorry for letting him love her when love was a luxury neither of them could afford. "Do not be," Edmund said through gritted teeth. "I would choose this again. Every time." The older man wiped blood from his face and studied them with cold eyes. "You will be tried before the council," he said. "The orc will hang. Larson, you might live if you renounce her and beg for mercy." "Go to hell," Edmund said conversationally. The man's fist connected with Edmund's jaw, snapping his head to the side, and Zasha roared with fury, lunging against her bonds. She nearly broke free through sheer strength, but more hands grabbed her, beating her down, and by the time they stopped she was bleeding from a split lip, and her vision swam with pain. They were hauled to their feet and marched away from the farm, away from the life they had tried to build, toward whatever judgment awaited them in the village. Zasha's mind raced through their options, searching desperately for escape routes or opportunities, but with both of them bound and surrounded, their chances looked grim. The village was a half-day's walk, and by the time they arrived both Zasha and Edmund were stumbling with exhaustion and abuse. They were thrown into a small wooden building that served as a jail, the door slamming shut and sealing them in darkness. Zasha sagged against the wall, her bound hands making it impossible to catch herself properly, and Edmund crawled across the small space to lean against her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "Nothing permanent," Zasha said, though her ribs ached and her lips still bled sluggishly. "You?" "Same." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their situation pressing down like a physical thing. Then Edmund laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I really thought we could make it work," he said. "Stupid, I know, but I thought if we just kept our heads down, stayed out of trouble, maybe the world would let us be." "It was not stupid," Zasha said fiercely. "It was hope, and hope is never stupid even when it fails us." Edmund turned his head to look at her in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. "I do not regret loving you," he said. "No matter what happens next, I want you to know that. These last months were the best of my life." Zasha's eyes burned with unshed tears. Mine too, she whispered. Even knowing how it ends, I would not change any of it. They leaned into each other, taking what comfort they could from proximity, and waited for dawn and the trial that would decide their fates. The trial, when it came, was a farce of justice. The village council was composed of 12 elders, all human, all predisposed to view Zasha as a monster and Edmund as a traitor. They were hauled before the assembly still bound, forced to stand while the older man, whose name was apparently Gareth, recounted finding Zasha living openly on Edmund's farm. "The crime is harboring an enemy of humanity," Gareth said, his broken nose a visible reminder of their fight. "The penalty is death by hanging for the orc and exile for the human if he renounces his association with the creature." "She has a name," Edmund snapped. "Her name is Zasha, and she is not a creature or a monster. She is a person, same as any of you, and she deserves to be treated as such." Murmurs rippled through the assembled villagers who had come to witness the spectacle. The head counselor, an ancient woman with sharp eyes, raised a hand for silence. "Edmund Larson," she said, her voice carrying despite its frailty. "You were a soldier. You fought orcs in the border wars. Why would you betray your own kind by sheltering one?" "Because I learned something in those wars that you never did," Edmund said, his voice ringing clear. "I learned that the enemy is not defined by the shape of their face or the color of their skin. The enemy is cruelty. The enemy is mindless violence. The enemy is refusing to see the humanity in others." He gestured toward Zasha with his bound hands. "This woman was cast out by her own people for choosing mercy over murder. She spared a human child's life when she could have killed her. And when I found her dying in my field, she did not attack me or threaten me. She asked me to end her suffering because she expected nothing else from a human. I chose differently. I chose to help her, and in doing so I found something I thought I had lost forever. I found companionship, purpose, love." His voice softened on that last word, and he looked at Zasha with such open affection that several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "So no, I will not renounce her. I will not beg for mercy while you kill someone whose only crime was accepting kindness when it was offered. If you are going to hang her, you will have to hang me too." The crowd erupted in noise, some shouting in outrage at Edmund's defiance, others arguing among themselves. The ancient counselor called for silence again, her expression unreadable as she studied both prisoners. "And you, orc," she said eventually, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Zasha had not expected to be given a chance to speak. She stared at the old woman for a long moment, then straightened despite her bonds, meeting those sharp eyes with her own. "My name is Zasha," she said, putting all the dignity she possessed into the words. "I am a warrior of the mountain clans, and I was exiled for the crime of mercy. I did not come to this land seeking conflict. I came seeking only to survive." She glanced at Edmund, then back to the council. "This human found me dying and chose to save my life. He owed me nothing. I was an enemy, a monster by your standards, and yet he saw past that. He taught me about a different way of living, about growing things instead of destroying them, about choosing kindness even when it is dangerous. I did not ask for his love, but I am grateful for it every day. If you decide I must die for the crime of accepting that gift, then so be it. But know that you are killing someone who wanted nothing more than to live in peace." The silence that followed her words was heavy and absolute. Then a voice from the crowd called out, "Let them go." The ancient counselor's head snapped toward the speaker, a young woman holding a child. "Explain yourself, Marie." "I was that child," Marie said, stepping forward, and Zasha's breath caught as she recognized the girl whose life she had spared all those months ago. The child had grown older, her fear replaced by something like courage. I was the one this orc refused to kill during the raid on our old village. I looked into her eyes and saw her choose mercy when she could have chosen violence. She saved my life. Do we repay that by taking hers? More voices joined the dissent, villagers who had heard Edmund's speech or been moved by Zasha's quiet dignity. The argument raged while Zasha and Edmund stood silent, hardly daring to hope. Finally, the ancient counselor raised her hand once more and the crowd fell silent. "This council will deliberate," she said. "Prisoners, you will be returned to your cell while we decide your fate." They were dragged back to the small wooden building, the door slamming shut once more, and Zasha sagged against Edmund with a shaky laugh. "That could have gone worse," she said. "Could have gone better too," Edmund pointed out, but he was smiling slightly, and Zasha felt a fragile hope taking root in her chest. They waited hours that felt like days, neither speaking much, simply drawing strength from each other's presence. Finally, as the sun began to set, the door opened and they were brought back before the council. The ancient woman studied them both for a long, weighing moment before she spoke. "This council has reached a decision," she said. "The testimony of young Marie carries weight, as does your own service to this land, Edmund Larson. It is clear that this orc is not the mindless savage we have been taught to expect. She chose mercy when violence would have been easier, and that choice saved a child's life." The old woman paused, letting the words sink in. "However, we cannot simply ignore the reality that you are an orc living among humans, or that your presence here represents a breaking of long-established boundaries between our peoples." Zasha's hope began to crumble, but the counselor was not finished. "Therefore, we propose the following. You will be released on the condition that you remain on Edmund Larson's farm and do not venture into the village or surrounding settlements without explicit permission from this council. You will cause no trouble, threaten no one, and live peacefully. Edmund Larson will be held responsible for your conduct. If you break these terms, both of you will face immediate execution. Do you accept these conditions?" Zasha looked at Edmund, seeing her own cautious hope reflected in his eyes. It was not freedom, not truly, but it was life. It was the chance to continue existing together, to build something in the shelter of his farm. It was more than she had ever dreamed of having. "We accept," Edmund said firmly, and Zasha nodded her agreement. "Then you are free to go," the counselor said. "But know this, we will be watching. Do not make us regret this mercy." They were released from their bonds, and Edmund took Zasha's hand as they walked from the village, neither speaking until the buildings were far behind them, and the familiar sight of the farm appeared on the horizon. Only then did Edmund stop, pulling Zasha into a fierce embrace. "We are alive," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are actually going to be okay." Zasha held him tightly, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Because you spoke for me," she said. "Because that child remembered mercy. Because somehow, impossibly, we got lucky." "Not luck," Edmund said, pulling back to cup her face in his hands. "Love. Love is stronger than hate, even when it seems impossible." Zasha kissed him then, pouring everything she felt into that contact, gratitude and relief and fierce, overwhelming love for this human who had defended her at the risk of his own life. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. They returned to the farm as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Zasha thought that this was what hope looked like, not the absence of danger, but the choice to build something good in spite of it. The months that followed were not easy. There were villagers who remained hostile to Zasha's presence, who muttered darkly about the council's decision and watched the farm with suspicious eyes. But there were others, like Marie and her family, who brought gifts of food and supplies, small gestures of acceptance that meant more than Zasha could express. Slowly, carefully, they built a life that included but was not defined by the prejudices of the world around them. Edmund expanded the farm, and Zasha helped him clear new fields and plant additional crops. They acquired more livestock, including a pair of goats that Zasha grew surprisingly fond of, despite their tendency to eat everything in sight. They worked from dawn to dusk during the growing season, their partnership seamless and strong, and when winter came again, they huddled by the fire and planned for the future. One evening, nearly a year after the trial, Edmund set aside the wood he was carving and looked at Zasha with an expression she had learned to recognize as significant. "I have been thinking," he said carefully. "Dangerous habit," Zasha teased, but her heart was beating faster. Edmund smiled, then grew serious again. "We never talked about making this official, about getting married in whatever way makes sense for us." Zasha's breath caught. Marriage was a human custom, not an orcish one, but she understood what he was offering: a formal commitment, a public declaration of their bond. "The village would never allow it," she said. "No priest would perform the ceremony." "Then we will make our own ceremony," Edmund said, taking her hands in his. "We will speak our own vows by our own rules. I do not need a priest to tell me that I belong with you, Zasha. I have known that for a long time. I just want you to know it too, officially, with all the weight of a promise behind it." Tears pricked at Zasha's eyes. That familiar weakness that Edmund had taught her was actually strength. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you by whatever ceremony we can manage." They planned their wedding for the spring, when the wheat was green and the world was full of growing things. On a clear morning with wildflowers blooming across the fields, they stood together in front of the farmhouse with no witnesses except the land itself, and spoke the vows they had written. Edmund went first, his voice steady and sure. "Zasha, I vow to stand beside you for as long as I live. I vow to defend you against any threat, to honor your strength, and to love you not despite our differences but because of them. You taught me that peace is built through small kindnesses and daily choices, and I choose you today and every day after." Zasha had to clear her throat twice before she could speak, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Edmund, I vow to build a life with you that honors both what I was and what I am becoming. I vow to protect what we have created together, to bring strength to our partnership, and to love you with everything I am. You taught me that mercy is not weakness but the greatest courage, and I choose you with all of that courage today and forever." They had no rings, but Edmund had carved 2 wooden bands that they exchanged, sliding them onto each other's fingers with trembling hands. Then they kissed, sealing the promise, and Zasha thought that this moment, this simple, profound commitment, was worth every hardship they had endured to reach it. The years that followed were marked by steady growth and deepening joy. The farm prospered under their combined efforts, producing enough to not only sustain them but to trade with the village for other necessities. Slowly, incrementally, attitudes began to shift. Children who had grown up hearing stories of the orc who lived peacefully on the Larson farm were less afraid than their parents had been. When drought struck the valley 3 years after their wedding, Zasha worked alongside human neighbors to dig irrigation channels, her strength invaluable, and her presence gradually accepted as normal rather than threatening. Edmund and Zasha built additions onto the farmhouse, expanding it from a bachelor's small quarters into a proper home. Zasha carved decorative patterns into the wooden beams, blending orcish designs with human aesthetics, creating something unique that belonged to both their heritages. They planted an orchard that would take years to mature, an act of faith in a future they would share. On their 5th anniversary, As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the wheat fields in shades of gold, Zasha leaned against Edmund's shoulder and said, "I never thought I would be happy. Not truly. I thought happiness was for people whose lives were not defined by violence. And now?" Edmund asked, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Now I know that happiness is what you build when the violence stops," Zasha said. "It is planting orchards and arguing with goats and waking up next to someone who sees you as you truly are." Edmund pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his touch familiar and cherished. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "That day when you wanted to leave after the men came searching, I am glad I convinced you to stay." "I am glad you started cooking dinner instead of finishing me," Zasha said, and Edmund laughed, remembering that first desperate day when she had asked him to end her life and he had offered soup instead. "Best decision I ever made," he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, the first stars emerging in the darkening sky. In the distance, smoke rose from the village chimneys, and Zasha could see the lights beginning to glow in windows. She was part of this valley now, woven into its fabric despite the odds, and the knowledge filled her with quiet satisfaction. "You ever regret it?" Edmund asked softly. "Leaving your clan, giving up the warrior's path?" Zasha considered the question honestly, as she always did with Edmund. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," she admitted. "Knowing exactly what was expected of me, what my purpose was, but I do not regret choosing mercy. I do not regret finding you. This life we built is worth more than all the battles I ever fought." "Good," Edmund said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Because I have gotten very attached to having you around, and I would hate to lose you to some misguided longing for your warrior past." Zasha elbowed him gently in the ribs, and his laugh rang out across the fields, warm and genuine and free. She thought about that first desperate whisper finish it, and how close she had come to never knowing this joy, this peace, this overwhelming sense of belonging. But Edmund had chosen differently. He had chosen to see her as a person rather than a monster, to offer help rather than death, to build rather than destroy. And in doing so, he had saved not just her life but taught her how to truly live. "I love you," Zasha said, the words as natural now as breathing. "I love you too," Edmund replied, pulling her closer. "Always." As the stars multiplied overhead and the night settled soft around them, Zasha closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply exist in this moment, safe, loved, and home at last. The warrior who had once whispered for death had instead found life, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. The farm continued its rhythms through the seasons, and Zasha and Edmund grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced hardships, harsh winters, crop failures, illness, but they faced them together, their partnership unshakable. They also experienced profound joys, abundant harvests, visits from Marie and her growing family, quiet mornings working side by side in the garden they had planted together. 10 years after that first desperate encounter in the wheat field, Zasha stood in that same spot and remembered the orc warrior who had been prepared to die there. She had been so certain that death was her only option, that a human would never show mercy to an enemy. How wrong she had been. How grateful she was to have been wrong. Edmund emerged from the barn, spotted her standing among the wheat, and walked over to join her. He had gray threading through his brown hair now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but his smile was the same one that had first made her heart race all those years ago. "Remembering?" he asked, slipping his hand into hers. "Always," Zasha said, squeezing his fingers. Remembering and being grateful. They stood together in the wheat field where their story had begun, where a dying orc had whispered for death, and a kind human had offered dinner instead. The choice Edmund had made that day had rippled outward, changing not just their lives but slowly, incrementally, beginning to change the attitudes of those around them. It was not a grand revolution, not a sweeping transformation of society, but it was a small crack in the wall of prejudice, proof that different peoples could live together in peace if they chose compassion over fear. "You think others will follow our example?" Zasha asked, voicing a hope she had held quietly for years. "Do you think more humans and orcs might find what we found?" Edmund was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe," he said eventually. "It takes courage to love across boundaries, to choose mercy when violence is easier, but we did it. We proved it was possible. And every person who hears our story, who sees us living peacefully together, might find the courage to make the same choice." "I hope so," Zasha said softly. "I hope no one else has to feel as alone as I did, believing they had no place in the world." "You have a place," Edmund said, turning to face her fully, his hands coming up to cradle her face with the tenderness that had never faded. "Right here. Always." Zasha kissed him, pouring gratitude and love and joy into that contact, and when they pulled apart she was smiling. "Let us go home," she said. "I think it is your turn to make dinner." Edmund laughed and took her hand, and together they walked back toward the farmhouse, toward the life they had built through determination and love and the radical choice to see each other's humanity. The sun was setting behind them, painting their path in golden light, and ahead the farmhouse waited warm and welcoming, a sanctuary they had created together. Inside, they would prepare dinner side by side, moving through the familiar dance of their partnership. They would eat at the table Edmund had built and Zasha had carved decorations into, surrounded by the small markers of their shared life. They would talk and laugh and plan for tomorrow, for next season, for all the years they hoped still lay ahead. And later, as they banked the fire and prepared for sleep, Edmund would hold Zasha close and whisper that he loved her, and she would whisper it back, and the words would be both prayer and promise, a defiance of every force that had tried to keep them apart. This was not the life either of them had imagined when they were young, the human soldier who dreamed of peace and the orc warrior who knew only battle. But it was the life they had chosen, built brick by brick and choice by choice, and it was beautiful in its hard-won simplicity. Zasha had whispered, "Finish it," in a wheat field, asking for death because she could not imagine mercy from a human. But Edmund had started cooking dinner instead, had offered kindness when she expected cruelty, had chosen to see her as a person deserving of help. And that choice, that single, radical act of compassion had changed everything. As they settled into sleep, Zasha's last thought was one of profound gratitude. Gratitude for Edmund's choice, for the life they had built, for every sunrise they had watched together and every challenge they had overcome. She had been prepared to die in that wheat field, but instead she had learned to truly live. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her in the circle of Edmund's arms, was the greatest gift she had ever received. The warrior had found peace. The exile had found home. The orc who expected only hatred had found love. In the morning, there would be more work, fields to tend, animals to feed, a farm to maintain. There would be challenges and difficulties, because life was never simple or easy. But they would face it all together, bound by vows they had spoken and promises they kept every day. The story that had begun with a desperate whisper for death had become a story of life, messy and complicated and beautiful and real. And as the years continued to pass, as their farm flourished and their love deepened, Zasha and Edmund became living proof that the walls between peoples could be crossed, that prejudice could be overcome, that mercy and kindness were not weaknesses, but the foundations of true strength. Their story spread quietly through the valley and beyond, told by travelers and traders, whispered around hearth fires as an example of what was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity. Not everyone believed it, not everyone approved. But for those who had the courage to hope, who dreamed of a world where different peoples could live in peace, the story of the orc and the farmer became a beacon. And on the farm where it all began, Zasha and Edmund continued their quiet life together, tending the land, caring for each other, and proving every day that love could transcend any boundary if given the chance to grow. The wheat grew golden in the fields where Zasha had once lain dying. The orchard they had planted together bore fruit, sweet and abundant. The farmhouse stood solid and welcoming, a home built by two people who refused to let the world's expectations define what they could become together. And when visitors came, as they increasingly did, drawn by curiosity or hope, or their own desperate need for proof that impossible love could survive, Zasha and Edmund welcomed them with the same grace Edmund had shown that first day. They shared their story without embellishment, speaking honestly about the challenges and the joys, the fears and the triumphs. They offered proof that different peoples could choose to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate, to see the person beneath the skin. Some visitors left inspired, others left skeptical, but all of them left having seen with their own eyes that an orc and a human could sit together in peace, could share a home and a life, could look at each other with obvious love and devotion. And that was enough. That was everything. Because every great change began with a single choice, a single moment where someone decided to act with compassion instead of fear. Edmund had made that choice when he found Zasha bleeding in his wheat field. Zasha had made that choice when she spared the human child. And together, they had built a life on those choices, brick by brick, day by day, until the impossible became simply reality. Years turned to decades, and their love never wavered. They grew old together on that farm, their bodies aging but their bond only growing stronger. And when their time finally came to leave this world, they left behind more than just a farm. They left behind proof that mercy and kindness could change everything, that love could transcend any boundary, and that the bravest thing anyone could do was choose compassion in a world that demanded hate. The orc warrior had whispered, "Finish it," in a wheat field, asking for death. But the man beside her had started cooking dinner instead, and in that simple act of kindness, he had changed both their lives forever. He had shown her that there was another way to live, another path beyond violence and survival. And together, they had walked that path all the way home,